Okay, let's talk about Genghis Khan. You hear that name and right away you probably picture this: brutal, unstoppable conqueror. But here's the thing. History gives us this totally shocking paradox. Was he a world-ending monster? Or was he the guy who basically built the modern world? It's a huge question. And in this explainer, we're going to try and unpack one of the most complicated legacies in all of history.
So, to really get a handle on the sheer terror he caused, let's start with someone who actually lived through it. This is a quote from historian Ibn al-Athir. He was so horrified, so completely broken by the Mongol invasion he saw with his own eyes, that he literally said he wished he'd never been born. To him, this wasn't just a war, it was the end of everything, an event so awful he couldn't even bring himself to write about it for years. But then, you fast forward about 170 years, and you get this. From Geoffrey Chaucer, the famous English poet, he's talking about the exact same guy, and he calls him an excellent lord, wise, rich, famous for being great. I mean, it's such a glowing review. It sounds like he's talking about a completely different person than the one who horrified Ibn al-Athir.
So, right there, that's our central mystery, isn't it? A monster who ends worlds, or an excellent, wise lord. How on earth can one person be both? To figure this out, we've got to dig in and look at the evidence for both sides of this incredible story.
Okay, let's start with the monster narrative. This is the part of the story that really cemented his reputation in, well, blood and fire. And it all kicks off with his encounter with the incredibly powerful Khwarazmian Empire. So this whole thing started because Genghis Khan wanted to trade, but it spiraled into all-out war so fast, his traders and then his actual diplomats were executed, and his response, well, he unleashed a level of fury the world had just never seen before. Even cities like Bukhara, which surrendered, were almost totally wiped out, and the ones that fought back, like Samarkand, annihilated. They even force-captured civilians to be human shields in the attacks. And the story of Neyshabur, it's just chilling. In revenge for his son-in-law's death, the order was given to kill every single living thing, down to the cats and dogs.
And this quote, wow, this just perfectly captures his whole mentality. He walks into the ruins of Bukhara and tells the survivors, "I am the punishment of God." He's basically saying, this is your fault. You sinned, and I am the divine consequence. This was so much more than just war, it was psychological warfare on a grand scale.
And here's the crucial thing to understand. His brutality wasn't just random rage. It was a cold, calculated strategy. You make a horrifying example out of one city that resists, and you make sure the stories of what you did spread like wildfire. Then, the next 10 cities in your path are so terrified that they surrender without you having to lift a finger. It was a brutally effective system that let a smaller army conquer a massive empire.
Okay, so that's the destroyer. But to understand the other side of him, the unifier, we have to rewind all the way back to the beginning. Because before he was Genghis Khan, the great conqueror, he was just a boy named Temujin. And the world he was born into was every bit as brutal as the one he would later create. Just imagine, you're 9 years old. Your dad, a tribal leader, gets murdered. And then your own clan just abandons you and your family to die in the wilderness. Temujin grew up as a total outcast, literally fighting for scraps to survive. He learned from a very young age that on the steppe, the only things that matter are strength, absolute loyalty, and being more ruthless than your enemies.
And this is where he turned everything on its head. See, before him, the Mongol tribes were a mess, always at war with each other, ruled by a bunch of nobles where all that mattered was who your dad was. Temujin threw that whole system out. He created a meritocracy. He didn't care about your bloodline. He cared if you were skilled and loyal. He promoted people from nothing. This was such a radical idea, and it inspired this incredible, fierce devotion that allowed him to do the impossible: unite all those warring tribes into a single Mongol nation.
And once he'd done that, once he had this unified nation, he didn't just rule with an iron fist. He actually built a system, a whole set of laws to govern what would become the largest land empire in the history of the world. And this is where we start to see a very, very different side of Genghis Khan.
This system was called the Yasa. You can think of it as a universal legal code for every single person in his empire. Now, we don't have the original written text, but historians from that time recorded its main ideas, and honestly, for the 13th century, they are absolutely astonishing.
I mean, just look at this: absolute religious freedom. In the 1200s, that's unheard of.
laws that applied to everyone equally, whether you were a prince or a peasant. He even protected merchants and ambassadors, the very thing that kicked off his brutal war in the first place. He was actively building a world that was stable, secure, and connected. What he created was basically a gigantic continental free trade zone, all protected by law. For its time, this was completely revolutionary.
So this brings us all the way back to our central problem. How do we square these two things? How do you reconcile the man who ordered the slaughter of every living creature in a city with the same man who guaranteed religious freedom for millions?
When you put it side by side like this, the contrast it's jarring. On the one hand, a destroyer who killed millions, who used tactics we'd call biological warfare today, like flinging plague-infected bodies over city walls. But on the other hand, a unifier who created systems of law, trade, and tolerance that were literally centuries ahead of their time.
In his conquests, they created the largest single land empire in all of human history. At its peak, it controlled an incredible 22% of the world's land area. The sheer scale of what he both destroyed and created is almost impossible to wrap your head around.
So, in the end, there really is no easy answer. Both of these truths have to exist at the same time. He was, without a doubt, a ruthless destroyer who used unimaginable terror to build an empire. And, at the same time, he was a visionary unifier who used that very empire to connect East and West, creating a foundation for the globalized world we know today.
And that really just leaves us with a final, really tough question. The brutality, it's just undeniable. But so is the world-changing impact of what he built. So how are we supposed to judge historical figures like Genghis Khan? People whose methods were absolutely monstrous, but whose legacy literally shaped the world we all live in. It's something to think about.